Okay, this other news story that I wanted to look at this morning. 500,000 people, a new record of inward immigration into Portugal. And I want to just go into the story a little bit more and reflect on it a bit, because it brings up all sorts of responses in me, and I'm sure it does in other people as well. And I thank the Portugal News for this, portugalnews.com, Portugal's national newspaper in English, which I believe was established back in the 70s. And I will share this story with you if it loads up on my tab this morning. I might have to find a different way of finding that this morning. But anyway, 500,000 people, and the population is 10.5 million. And I'm open to challenge, obviously, on my mathematics there. But I make that a ratio of one person in every 21 is an incomer coming in to Portugal, which I think is pretty extraordinary. I don't know what you think about that. Do let me know in the comments on Facebook Live here, or I've also posted it up in the not Pure Portugal. Probably will do that as well, actually, because I'm sure that'll get a conversation started over in Pure Portugal. But on the Good Morning Portugal group, such as it is at the moment, not many people there yet, but I'm sure that will grow, and we can discuss this issue. And here's a little bit of background information, actually, from The Independent. Whilst that Portuguese news story is not showing up on my feed, I can actually go to theindependent.co.uk to find out what the Portuguese government think about this. Minister says Portugal has overcome barriers to attracting more migrants. Portugal's government is celebrating rising immigration numbers after the number of foreign nationals living in the country hit 500,000 for the first time in history, as I've said. The socialist-led government said Portugal had overcome barriers to attracting more migrants, who it says are needed due to the country's relatively low birth date, and I think that is a typo, it should say birth rate, and ageing population. Preliminary data prompt me to say that in 2019, for the first time in our history, the barrier of 500,000 foreign citizens residing in Portugal has been overcome, Interior Minister Eduardo Cabrita told the country's parliament on Wednesday. The minister told MPs there were 580,000, that's a lot more, that's another 80,000 beyond your 500,000 foreign nationals were living in Portugal at the end of 2019, up from 490,000 at the end of 2018. The debate in Portugal over migration contrasts with that in other EU countries, notably the UK, where the government has been aiming to reduce immigration. Portugal is one of 10 EU states where fewer than 5% of residents are foreign-born. Portugal is one of 10 EU states where fewer than 5% of residents are foreign-born. Between 2011 and 2016, it also suffered strong emigration due to the fallout from the global financial crisis and austerity. There's your trouble, right? That is a massive interference in the standing population of a country. In 2017, and that's me saying that, that's my commentary on this piece. In 2017, Prime Minister Antonio Costa's government passed new laws to boost immigration, with the legislation taking effect in the autumn of 2018. We need more immigration, and we won't tolerate any xenophobic rhetoric, Mr. Costa said at the time. Wow. The changes made it easier to come to Portugal for seasonal work, casual work and study, while the process for regularising undocumented migrants was also modernised. That's good, isn't it? The opposite to what is going on in America, I think, certainly if Donald Trump has his way. Visas and other bureaucracy were also streamlined. Notably, goodness, what was it like before? Notably, the Portuguese government has also promised a 50% income tax cut until 2023 to tempt back Portuguese immigrants who have left the country for at least 3 years. That's quite a nice sweetener, isn't it, to bring people back to the country? Mr. Costa's Socialist Party leads a minority administration that governments with ad hoc support from communists and the radical left. Again, that's against the trend, isn't it, in Europe? His party was re-elected in 2019 with a higher percentage of the vote than in 2015, with 22 more seats. So there you go. Portugal bucking the trend in at least a couple of ways there, and being open to attracting more migrants. I'm not sure. From the original piece that I was looking at in the Portugal news, I don't know if that includes people from the former colonies of Portugal in those figures. I suspect it does, and it would be interesting to know exactly how that is made up, where people are coming from. And I wonder what it's like to be Portuguese in the face of that. Having come from the UK, where it's a very, very touchy subject, and rightly so. I'm not saying I've not got a hard and fast position on that. I'm actually quite, I think, receptive to a lot of the arguments that are put forward on immigration. And ultimately, decisions have to be made, don't they? So that, people will be disappointed, as we've seen in the way of politics. It seems like we might be getting down to some really big issues that have tended to be avoided, immigration being one of them. And ultimately, politicians and not social servants, that'd be a good name for them, wouldn't it? Civil servants have to actually put things into practice, which will inevitably disappoint some people and their ethics and moral view on these matters. But I just wonder what it's like, and if you're a Portuguese person hearing this, first of all, I have to say I'm very grateful for Portugal's open door and receptivity, which is based obviously on the UK's soon-to-be former membership of the European Union. So that's made it very easy for me to come here when I visited previously, and also when I've decided to just move here and apply for residency, which we've done. It's been an easy process. It hasn't felt awkward or difficult, or that anyone's trying to stop us or is judging us. They might have been. I just wasn't that aware of it. What I noticed about, it's not what I noticed, is this is my own theory about Portuguese people and their position with immigration and their view of expats and immigrants and incomers and foreigners, is that they've got quite a strong history themselves of leaving the country. They're kind of cosmopolitan and global in their own outlook and genetics, and not, as I said before, not necessarily for great reason, because, it's not like, oh, the world's a lovely place, let's go and explore it. I've heard of people walking to France from Portugal when in previous times of economic hardship, I think in the 70s and 80s. And then, when austerity kicked in more recently, when was that? 2008. Again, causing a mass emigration. This is not a romantic thing. This is an economic and political and social reality that people have to do that. So I'm not trying to make out it's like some kind of romantic and mythical thing in the spirit of Vasco da Gama living on, although it may do, of course, as well. But people have been forced abroad. People have been forced to look elsewhere, overseas. But I think that has brought an openness and open-mindedness and a global mentality and awareness to Portuguese people, which is then afforded other people who come into the country. And people are friendly and open and interested and happy to share with what the goodness of this country, it would appear. That's certainly how I've experienced it. So I'm very grateful for that. And I also wonder, this is a little bit ironic possibly and contradictory, but I also wonder, what that means, what that is like when the numbers start to get a little bit, like they appear big. 500,000's a big number, and 1 in 21 million people, one person out of every 21 being an incomer. I wonder what sociological effect that will have. And I don't have an answer to that. I just think it's something, in politics, it's better to be forearmed, isn't it, and aware and be discussing these things rather than to have deep-seated areas of discomfort and resentment or awkwardness, so that it can be talked about and it can be managed and it can be, it's all about the conversation. In my other job in Ownet as the community builder, town crier of Ownet, which we have just christened the place of conversations. It is our belief at Ownet that the conversation is the powerhouse of all change and evolution, for better or for worse. But you've got to have the conversations, and you've got to have the context in which those conversations take place, and the context determines the quality of those conversations. So here we are on the Good Morning Portugal radio show. I'm creating an open context for the discussion of these issues. And it's a political hot potato, let's face it, immigration. And it gets people really worked up because it feeds in and touches their national identity and their sense of survival, obviously. Let me just say, as well as good morning, hola, bon dia to Rowan. Hola, bon dia to you, Dan. Bon dia to you, Shmriti. Thank you for your very kind comments about Good Morning Portugal. And Jeannie is here, who says, bon dia da Belgica. And my educated guess there is she's saying, good morning from Belgium. So lovely to hear from you, Jeannie. I don't think we've seen you on the show so far. So there you go. I don't know what your thoughts are about this. 1 in 21 people, according to my mathematics, being an incomer in Portugal, and what that might mean, and what the responsibility is, I suppose, for incomers as well, to manage that and be responsible for it. So I, as well as thinking there should be free movement in the world in many ways, obviously you don't want the free movement of bad people, if you like, of people who are known to be, who could be a problem. How do you talk about these things, without sounding judgmental and making it sound like xenophobia or racism or whatever? But, I think the conversation should be had. And free movement, yes. Opening yourself up to vulnerability and negativity that is harmful, no. Why would you do that? You don't do that in your own house? Why would you do that as a country? But how on earth do you manage that process, I suppose, is the question I'm asking. And what is the responsibility of incomers to a place? And this isn't just about a country, is it? I suppose this is about when you go anywhere in the world as a person, how you are responsible for how you show up somewhere, and how your conversations, how your relationships are managed with the people in the new place where you find yourself. And conversely, how is it to be somebody who welcomes other people in? And love is obviously the best guide, isn't it, as ever? To endeavor to come from a loving place and an open place and an open-minded and an open-hearted place. I think we're going to get the best results if we do that. But I also think we're not going to get the best results if we don't open up the conversation and start talking about things that are difficult. And that seems to be a big theme in the world at the moment, isn't it? We would rather not talk about things that are difficult until they become so difficult that we are very emotional about them, and then we can't have a decent conversation about them anyway. That will be Munson's theory of sociological interaction. Okay, so communicate early before things get difficult and emotional, because by the time they've got difficult and emotional, you might not be able to have a very good conversation. But that's what I urge you and encourage you to do, is have a conversation in the Good Morning Portugal group about this topic and this new record of inward immigration into Portugal. So thank you for letting me develop that thesis with you this morning. Let us end the show today with a little look at a beautiful little two-bedroomed bungalow. We go from one massive issue, don't we, to a very prosaic and arguably materialistic part of the show where we're looking at property. But I have to, that is part of the joy of Portugal, is the diversity and beauty of property here. And yeah, it has to be said, getting a bargain. And this is another part of it, isn't it? This is another part of the whole immigration thing, is, how we exploit relatively our wealth in new places, and what that's like for the people who are selling those things and the neighbors and the people in that community already. And it also has to be said, we're all subject to this financial and economic and political system which has us behaving that way. So we got to keep talking, we got to keep listening, and we got to be thinking about what it is that's causing this turmoil, if there is any, and this difficulty of how we relate to each other, and how that is an economic conversation, and how that makes us behave towards each other. Anyway, I'm mixing up the features of the show.